All right, thank you very much. And to keep things simple, you can literally just do that. We don't need the rest of that stuff. And I've been thinking, I've been going around a lot of talks recently about AI and teaching and learning. So I'm in my AI era right now. I know I saw some of you on Wednesday. You'll see some of the same stuff, but I've also put some new stuff in there for you today. But this is something that I think about a lot. How do we use AI in the classroom and for our educational practices more generally? How does it fit into the teaching and learning sphere? I think about it because I'm engaged in teaching and learning on multiple levels. I teach graduate students a lot. I also supervise graduate students who are teaching an undergraduate class. And that undergraduate class happens to be a class on technology used for pre-service teachers. So you see, it's like this step and stair thing that we can just keep going down level by level by level. So it's really important to me. And one of the things that I hear right away by people is this, oh my gosh, it's all going to take over the technology. What you're looking at there is the CyberMax head-mounted display by Victormax Technologies, a company that I happened to work for around 1995 when I just finished my first master's degree. I did a thesis on instructional virtual environment. I was really deep in on this stuff. And you know what I heard? We'll have these virtual reality bots that are going to teach our kids everything. We'll plug in at home. I think after COVID, we all know we don't want that. Right? Nobody wants to sit at home all day long. No, not a great thing. But this was something that people talked about quite a bit. Now, this particular technology, which isn't AI technology, you know, having your screen strapped on your head, this was not even the time for it. So, but I want to point out that this technology has had a lot of attention in the last 5-6 years in gaming. It was getting attention then in gaming, but it wasn't stable enough yet, and the gamers couldn't really afford it yet. The only people who could afford it who wanted to use it were in the adult entertainment industry. That was not where we wanted to bring our product to market, really, and it wasn't even enough of a market to fully sustain us, so we moved on. So let's move ahead a decade. 2005, had it even happened yet? Nope, none of this stuff is happening. 2015, nope. Well, where are we now? 2025. I know, it feels like anything can happen this year. You wake up every morning and you don't really know what's happened while you slept overnight. But as of today, we have made it through 2 solid months. And none of this taking over stuff has happened yet. I am safe. AI has not stolen my job. And I'm feeling good about this, okay? I'm feeling pretty confident it's not going to take my job. I also feel like I need to address, before I dive in a little deeper into teaching and learning, the other elephant in the room, which Michael so wonderfully went into. I'm going to dive in with a little bit of research. So, ethical or unethical use of AI, is this okay? So this data is based on a survey of undergraduate students, and they were asked about various behaviors. We used a validated scale called the multidimensional ethics scale. You're just looking at some real condensed results here. The final point of, is this okay or not? So the scale of from 1, which is ethical, 7 is unethical. So higher scores, what they said was most unethical. Writing a paper is most unethical. Getting AI to do it for you. Composing a discussion board. Because notice that's like getting it to write it all for you is what they believe is least acceptable. It gets a little murkier when we get down to things like getting a paper outline or getting something that we don't understand explained to us, or perhaps it's not reading it so that we can just get the Cliff Notes version, and that's been going on forever and ever and ever, right, Michael? I know you've been dealing with Cliff Notes your entire career. We also asked them if they would do it themselves or would a peer do it. Again, this is a 1 to 7 scale, but this time, you know, you take a look at those numbers, they think that their peers are more likely to do any of this than they are. And of course, the numbers are going in the opposite direction. They're not likely to do those unethical things. So this is what the students are telling us. We also asked them, what do you think in general? This time it's a 10-point scale that they've got. And it's kind of coming out in the middle if you look at those means. They're not really sure. Is this a useful academic tool? Maybe. Should instructors integrate it? Or even less certain about that? So there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a pretty wide range there if you look at those standard deviations. Students don't really know. So we talk a lot about what the students are doing with it. But for as much as there are some who are geniuses or evil geniuses with the technology, there's also a whole lot of, I'm not sure what's going to happen. So that's when we get into what we need to do, which is define a relationship with our generative AI. How are we going to relate to it? One way is as a search engine. I don't actually recommend this. We have lots of good search engines out there, but I wanted to bring this up because this comes from another study I've done with undergrads where we dropped them down in front of their computers and said, okay, I want you to use ChatGPT to create lesson plans. And you know what a lot of them did? They literally typed in lesson plan and waited to see what they got. And then if they didn't like that, they would type in lesson plan English. Lesson plan English second grade. But they didn't actually dialogue with it, right? So like they didn't get there to any of the cool and meaningful stuff that you could be doing. They didn't really know how they could use it. But if we look at some of these other ways, okay, so we could start to use it as an assistant. You know, I'm just like, give me this. Give me that. I need this to do my job. I do this all the time. Like, you know, I would like to see an outline for doing this kind of thing. I would like a template for doing this kind of thing. I'm going to go in and modify it, but it can help me figure out what the structure is or just bring me these familiar things. Or we can use it as a catalyst to speed up a process. I can use it to help me synthesize a lot of things, which, yes, I can go through myself, but it's going to be a slow and tedious process, and it can do it pretty quickly. Or we can use it as a muse to get ideas. A really wonderful example that I have of using this was having a student with a visual disability in a class and a really visual assignment in there. Because again, this was a class for pre-service teachers. And they were learning how to use computers, and computers are pretty visual things, and graphics are some of the things that we were teaching. And I was just locked into my own brain. I was trying to come up with a solution. And what would be an alternative to this assignment? You know what it said? Audio. And I was like, oh gosh, I was so locked into thinking about alternative to visual that I didn't even go to audio. And then it made all the sense in the world, and this was brilliant. So lots of options that we have here. But before we use it, I think we need to ask ourselves, what's the problem that we're trying to solve? Why are we bringing something else in? Was our system broke? No, it wasn't broke. We were functioning just fine. So what problem are we trying to solve? And if we bring this in as a solution, what new problems does it create for us? This is being a pragmatist about the teaching and learning setting. We have to think about our division of labor. What's the human going to do? What's AI going to do for us? And I think, again, this is some of what Michael was tapping into so nicely. And I like to think about it in terms of these different dimensions. There's the ethics of it all, but we also need to think about accuracy. When I use AI, I'm using my own expertise quite a bit because in the end, I'm judging its accuracy. I don't trust it. I just think it can do a lot of things for me. And that gets into efficiency. A lot of the time I use it because it's going to be efficient, more efficient than me if it is accurate. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's going to be more trouble than it's worth to do it. And then there's that learning concern. And, you know, again, that taps into what do people need to be able to do at the end? Is the end game here? As I heard John Mark talking from somewhere out in the audience during the earlier study video, you know, is the end game that we're teaching people how to be AI operators, or is there some other learning that's going to happen here? Now, I like to go deep into this, hopefully resonates with my education people who've taken ed psych courses. I like to go deep back into all of that. This is an activity system. You're like, whoa, what does that mean? It's pretty simple, as with most things. Just think about the two words there, activity system. Activities occur in a system. If you change one part of the system, what's going to happen to the rest? It needs to respond in some way. So if we start to think about this, we have a learner who's our subject, our input into our system. Now I thought about this, is that the object, right? What does the learner want to do? They want to learn, and the outcome is complete a class. That's just what kind of happens, we hope. Although I thought some learners might put that in the opposite order and say that their object was to complete the class, and then we hope by byproduct of that they actually learn. We'll not get into that today. We can have a whole conversation about that. The tool that I want to focus on right now is thinking about generative AI, but there are lots of other tools that we can load in there. There are a lot of them in the system, and I encourage you to think of tools more broadly. than just these technologies that we can touch or the software that's sitting within there, but processes or tools as well. We have some rules. So in our educational environment, we have academic integrity rules. We have FERPA, privacy rights for people. We have intellectual property concerns. We think about the community. So in this case, the learner is going to be working with peers and their instructor. We could also bring out the community a little bit larger than that and start to think about other entities in the profession that they're going to enter, or other places on other people on the campus. And then finally, the division of labor. Who's going to do what and what's going to happen? So preparing and teaching class, completing assignments, providing feedback. So we can lay all this out and say, what are the parts of the system? And then we start to look at the tensions of. And so this is how I've come to think about this. And, like we've got some good tensions between generative AI as a tool and some of the rules that we're dealing with. And Michael spoke to a lot of that. And it's pushing us to really rethink what we do. We have, and this is some of what I think Jean-Marc was tapping into earlier, we have some tensions about the tool and the object and the outcome that's going to happen. So again, it's yet another thing in this activity system that we need to grapple with. There's some tensions between the tools causing a lot of tensions here, isn't it? There's some tensions between the tool and the community of who's going to do what. And I can tell you, I have seen cases even of, among peers working on group projects. And one was like, I think my classmate's using AI and I'm really not cool with this. And how am I going to do this? And then finally, there are tensions between the tool and the division of labor, because suddenly, I almost thought, did I need to add generative AI, not just as a tool, but as a community member here? Because once we start talking about it as something that we can dialogue with, something that's like, it's almost on the edge of having agency, I would say. I don't know, I have to think about that some more. But when we get into the division of labor, we're handing stuff over to it wholesale in some cases. Maybe we shouldn't be, but it happens. And so I find this activity system to be a really useful way of thinking about what happens when we get into the teaching and learning setting and we're bringing in generative AI. Now, with that, I want to start thinking about what are some of these things that we could actually be doing in terms of teaching and learning. And I like to think of this in terms of everyday innovations. Like, we can hear about all of the fancy stuff that people are experimenting with out on the cutting edge, the new developments that are happening when you have a lot of money and a lot of technology and programmers and all of that stuff. But I like to think about what plain old folks can do. I teach at FSU. I have access to FSU's version of Copilot. I know that's secure. So as an instructor, I can use it to help in the design process, whether it's designing content or activities or planning and scaling course activities. It's actually really good at this kind of scaling stuff where you say, I teach this class over 15 weeks in the full semester, and now I've got to teach it in 12 weeks over the summer session. How might I rearrange the schedule? Like, it can make some really useful suggestions for this. In terms of facilitation, I love to do case-based learning, but I could spend a lot of time writing cases for my students, or if I ask them to generate cases and swap them around the classroom, and people go down the rabbit hole, and usually the point wasn't the case, but the discussion that was going to happen based on the case. So I can ask my friend Copilot to create some different cases for me. And then I got to look over them, I've got to adjust them, but it does a lot of this really great labor for me. I have to think about, am I going to demonstrate AI use in my classroom as well? And also, am I going to talk about how we assess AI's outcomes in my classroom? Because note that I've said a couple of times, I'm the expert, I'm assessing what's happening here. But if I don't teach my students how to do that, how are they going to use AI effectively? That maybe needs to be part of their learning. And then finally, assessment. I actually don't want to get too deep into assessment here. I like to leave that to other people to really get into, like, is it okay? How many was it, Michael? How many? 1.6 million essays. I'm so sorry, my child's going to be contributing to that next year. It doesn't sound like fun. And we could get into, should humans be looking at that, or should AI be looking at these things? But even just as an individual in a small class where I'm not going to turn fully to AI for this stuff, I can use it to help me rethink assignments, rethink rubrics, come up with a rubric for when I don't have one yet, but I have the assignment. We could get into some of the automated grading. So automated grading and predictive analytics, kind of interesting because it's happening already and it's built into our existing tools and it's behind the scenes. And we don't have negative feelings about that most of the time. We just kind of look at it as something that happens. But then when we talk about putting it into something new, everybody's like, oh, yeah. But that's something for us to think about. It's there. So let's flip over to the learning side. Now, the learner perspective on this. And nothing that I have in here has to do with writing your papers for you. But learners can use generative AI to help them with practice. So they can dialogue on course materials. A number of us at FSU were working on a co-pilot pilot project, co-pilot with creating a focused chatbot to be used within classes where you could feed in your course materials and then students could have dialogues about that. Students can use it to develop study plans and use their time wisely, be able to, and some students really struggle with some of that executive functioning stuff, and this can really help them figure out what to do. But beyond that, I like to put out the idea of exploration because I think as instructors, when we've truly inspired our students, what do they want to do? Not just learn what we've asked them to learn in the classroom, but go to the next step. And so that gets into brainstorming or testing hypotheses or just playing. And, you know, a lot of students, I've done a lot of research with students about a lot of topics over the years. And when you start getting into different areas, they'll tell you, I don't talk to my friends about this. I don't talk to my parents about this. And you say, why? Like, well, because they don't. Nobody's really interested in this. Just me. It's just me geeking out. Well, you know what? AI will geek out with you about that all day long if that's what you want. It will talk with you back and forth. It is not going to get tired of that. So go have fun and play. And then in assessment, we still can use it without asking it to write our papers for us. The student can ask it to quiz them on course material, or if it is okay with the instructor to get formative feedback. I mean, I love this idea of asking students to take what they wrote and the rubric and feed it in and get feedback and then respond to the feedback and then turn all of that in to the instructor to show what they did and how they worked with it. And that's actually getting pretty authentic to the way that they might be using it in the workforce as well. Oh, and that final bit about polishing and editing that's on there. I mean, like, oh, I'm using Grammarly. Okay, we're doing that. We are doing that. So, you know, what do students need to learn? I think this is another thing for us to think about, and I'll tap back into what John Mark was saying. I think all of our original learning content and outcomes hold, but we also need to start to consider how do we use AI effectively, and that's going to vary by the discipline. It's not just a let's create a class for students. Let's require it, a new gen ed class on AI use. I don't think that solves this issue. I think we need to think about AI use in the discipline. We also need to teach them how to define the relationship with AI, to see the different ways they can relate to it and can bring it into their learning practices, their everyday life practices, their future work practices. I mean, let's not have them using it when they should just go to Google. I mean, that has a whole environmental sustainability issue for me, big time. It pains me every time I see them doing that. And also to think about the critical perspectives on AI use. So even if we're in an educational context, even if we're in a class where we are totally geeking out and having fun to see what we can do with AI and how we can stretch it to the boundaries and build cool things and make good stuff happen, let's always take a moment to think about what the negatives, what the challenges might be with what we're doing. I think having that critical perspective actually helps us move forward with it more productively than if we try to just bulldoze forward and be Pollyanna-ish and pretend that everything is going to be wonderful and there is no downside to it. With all of this, I think we need to think about pedagogical spaces and our expertise and how AI comes into this. Because, again, I'm coming from a student perspective here, ideal student perspective. Because I know some of them show up in the classroom and then show up for assessment and that's it. But ideally, a student is preparing in advance of class, and then they show up to the classroom in some sort of learning experience happens. And then they go home and they do more practice, and then they engage in assessment. If we keep AI out of the classroom, if we don't talk about it, if we don't model its use and guide its use as educators, it will be there in what they do for practice and assessment, but it's not going to be visible to us, and we're not going to have the opportunities to work with them. And this goes beyond just this issue of, again, is it writing the papers? Is it doing the stuff we don't want it to do? We know that there's an accuracy issue. We know that students are in our classes to learn things, to build content expertise in an area. And if they are practicing with AI and AI is leading them astray, how are we going to correct that? They'll get to the assessment and they're going to be frustrated because they're going to get things incorrect. So if we bring the loop back on this, who says it has to move straight forward from preparation classroom practice to assessment? We can have them practice and loop it back to the classroom where we have the human expert. And we can debrief whatever happened in the practice with the human expert. And we also have this opportunity to practice together and bring some of that into that classroom space. So instead of having AI just be something that sits there on the computer for personal interaction one-on-one and we don't talk about it, maybe what we need to do is bring it into this communal classroom space and talk about it. So as I wrap this up, some of my closing thoughts are, we've got this, we can access it, we can experiment with it as educators. There's a lot that we can do at this point in time, but I think that there's a lot that we're not prepared for just yet. There's some help that we need along the way. And so with that, I really want to stress that we need the time and the support to learn. And time is so hard to come by because our time is already all accounted for. It was full before we had generative AI. But if we're going to use it, we need to carve out that time. We need some guidance and guardrails for this as well. What is going to be okay and what is not going to be okay? Along those lines, secure accounts, I think it's really important we point out that there's a big difference between just going out and randomly using public accounts of ChatGPT. If you are feeding your students' work up into that, you are feeding the beast their intellectual property. That's not an okay thing to do. So we need to look to the institutions that we work for to be providing those secure accounts for us where we're not feeding the beast whenever we're doing something with AI. We need to have clear but flexible policies for how we're going to use AI in different academic contexts. And if you go around the university and you talk to different people, you're going to hear differing perspectives. You're going to hear, we've had a bit of story, like the whole range between the look at all the cool stuff that my class is doing. No, we're not even going to have the conversation. What exactly is the language I put in the syllabus that tells my students that under no circumstances are you to even have the thought that you might use AI at some point in time in this class? We need to have a way to accommodate that, recognizing that different classes are going to have different learning outcomes by design. We need to have permission to fail, and I think this one is really important because nobody's going to get it right the first time. It's all a big experiment as we try to learn this, as we seek some guidance and guardrails to help us maybe get a little more successful with it, but again, we still need this permission to fail, and then we need to not keep it to ourselves, right? It's not just like, oh, I failed, and I'm sorry, please don't look at me in my failure, but rather, we need to be able to walk out and say, hey guys, I tried, totally didn't work, but I want to tell you, because you might want to try it too, but also maybe you could help me think of the way to make it better. And those sharing spaces can be really powerful spaces for us. We need these things. And finally, this big picture, it's our job to prepare youth to become savvy and ethical users. We need to figure out how to make that happen. We need to support future workforce development. We need to support future citizen development. All of this is really important. So AI is here. What are we going to do with that? So as I close this out, I would really like to wish you all the best in your future AI failures and to encourage you to reach out and share. And yeah, I asked Copilot to create me an image that said permission to fail, spaces to share, and this is what it came up with. Thank you very much. Before my mom to call me, it's time to go to questions.
Just a little bit more concretely, a couple slides back, he talks about the need for, on the one hand, guidance and guardrails, and on the other hand, clear, flexible policies. Maybe it's my limitation, but I don't understand how you would achieve both of those. Could you give me like some concrete examples?
Yeah, and I think it's going to be context dependent, of course, for everybody. But like, how far? Let's talk about what we're going to put into AI. So I'm sitting here and I'm teaching a class, and I'm thinking, like I could use this to help me plan things with my class. Maybe I could use this to help me with assessment in my class. And then I got to ask, what's okay for me to feed into? And what are the consequences of me feeding different things into AI? And to me, like, that's what the guidance is, that's what some of the guardrails are. And I have to think about this, like, let's dive in deeper into this intellectual property issue. I have to think about this in terms of the articles that I've selected to assign for my class and whether or not I have the rights to do that. I have to think about my students and their things, and then I have to go back and think about whatever my own relationship is with my teaching materials and any other stuff that's mine and how I'm going to put it in. So I think that's where we can get this sort of guidance and guardrails and some general ideas about how we might do it, and also some real like, you really want to stay in between here. You want to stay in this lane unless you really know what you're doing. And creating those kinds of boundaries, and they can be flexible boundaries. I would give different advice to somebody who's just starting out with this versus somebody who wants to probably give me advice because they're so much further along on their path. But trying to save people from some of the failures that actually would cause problems and discomfort for them would be a wonderful thing. And that's something that we can do by having some the guidelines and flexible policies. And by flexible policies, I'm thinking about things like my department, my program came up with our own AI use policy because right away we knew people were going to be using it, especially in our discipline. And we sat in a room, we couldn't all agree from class to class what should happen. We couldn't have a one size fits all policy. And so we've actually written something into it that says, unless your instructor says otherwise. But we went through all of these use cases, and we revisit it every time we have a retreat, at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. And we're actively thinking about how this is developing, how we want to use it in our classes, and what uses are okay, what uses are never okay, and which ones need to be up to the instructor. And then we've given language for this that we can share. And I think sometimes having that language that somebody else has vetted for you even and knows what it needs is a really helpful thing. I'm not sure if I exactly answered your question there, but I hope that's getting at it.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa, for such a thought-provoking presentation. I really am intrigued by the idea of the AI flipped classroom. I would love to talk more about that. But my question right now is a little bit more philosophical, to go back to your point about AI as a member of the community, not just as a single agent, as if it was one person, one entity generating thoughts, but all of the community input that goes into it. So I just wanted you to kind of expand on your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, the idea behind generative AI is that it is taking in all of this input and it's synthesizing it and it's learning from it, it's identifying patterns, it's putting out output that's based on patterns, and it's doing the same thing that we expect our students to be doing when we're sitting in the classroom learning with new material and all. And then if we're inviting generative AI into the teaching and learning space and asking it to be a contributor of things, we are asking it to do the same kind of thing. So I feel like it's getting closer and closer and closer to being a part of the community. And we sit there and we will say things like, let's go check and see what would happen. What would Copilot say? What would ChatGPT say about this? We even start anthropomorphizing and talking about it in this way. And the creators love this. Not sure how I feel about that part, but the way that it can operate when the relationship becomes more in that muse and catalyst zone really does we start to give the technology agency that way, where it is a part of our own community. But I don't have the answers yet. I think these are some really interesting things for us to be debating, and I think some people will be really excited by that idea, and others will be really uncomfortable with that idea.
Yeah, just thinking about how one individual classroom student's input to AI would be almost a drop in the bucket to the, the full LLM that's operating, but multiple classrooms across the US adopting policy and integrating more, and how much of the community is isolated into one activity systems versus the broader.
Oh, you're going big with yeah. See, I wasn't even thinking that way, because I'm actually thinking about, like, I'm literally in the classroom with my students, and we're all here in this space, and then we collectively are going in and inviting AI into our conversation. But yeah, that's a whole other idea of this distributed agency of AI.
Definitely got me thinking about it.
Oh, we could keep going on this one.